Hello and welcome to today's edition of IIEA Insights with me, Dan O'Brien. In this edition, we will discuss Ireland's energy insecurity. Our guest today is Eamonn O'Reilly, Chair of the Energy and Climate Action Committee of the Irish Academy of Engineering and, as you might expect, an engineer by profession. He previously worked on power plant projects around the world, and he knows a bit about shipping stuff, including energy, from his time as Chief Executive of Dublin Port for 12 years to 2022. You're very welcome, Eamonn. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Dan.
Those on the call may put questions via the Q&A function, and as usual, the conversation will be publicly available as a podcast, but we don't include the questions to ensure members their questions don't go into the public domain. So we won't include your questions if we get to them. So let's kick off, Eamonn. One of the things that literally keeps me awake at night is the risk that our gas pipeline from Scotland goes down, whether by accident or by sabotage. Just for some context, Ireland's energy mix is very heavily dependent on gas. Increasingly, that gas is imported via that single pipeline. It's well known in the energy business here that the consequences for the Irish economy, for Irish society, would be quite catastrophic if such a big chunk of our both electricity generation capacity and home heating and industrial gas use were to be affected, because it would take months to repair any pipeline damage. How right or wrong am I to be worried about that, Eamonn?
I think you're absolutely correct, Dan, to be worried about it. And there's three reasons I give. As long ago as 2013, the National Risk Assessment identified a geopolitical risk from Russian aggression in the Crimea. So years before the Russians actually invaded Ukraine, the Irish Risk Assessment was identifying we had this exposure to our energy pipelines. The second context for this, I think, if you look at the mix of our fuels coming into Ireland, 83% of the energy of Ireland comes from fossil fuels. And the two biggest pieces of that 83% are oil and gas. When it comes to the oil, and oil is 51%, we have 90 days of stocks in place on the island, in the Republic, in Northern Ireland, and some of it's held up in Estonia, under an arrangement put together by the, I have to be careful with all these acronyms, the IIEA, the International Energy Agency, put in place after the 1970s, when it was well understood that there were energy security risk exposures which had to be mitigated. And in fact, Ireland is at the moment involved in a program with 30 other countries. We're releasing oil into the market. So nominally, we've 90 days of oil stored for Ireland. That's now down towards about 80. And that's been a coordinated effort in response that's been going on over the last number of weeks. And then you look at other countries. You look at Greece, for example, is the one I'd look at. They'd have a gas consumption about the same as Ireland. And they would have capacity for about 37 days. You look at the Netherlands and Denmark, they've close to 200 days capacity between geological storage and LNG. And we have precisely nothing. And we have this enormous dependence, you're completely correct, on gas coming out of Britain on two roughly parallel, they actually cross each other, roughly parallel pipelines from Scotland into Ireland, diminishing flows coming from Corrib. That's coming towards the end of its life. We are. And
Eamonn, can I just on the Scottish pipeline, how close are those, particularly for sabotage purposes? If a bomb were to explode beside one, would that take out the other one?
It depends on where. They cross. Somewhere north of the Isle of Man, undersea, they cross. So they are very, very close to each other. Yeah, so whether it's a very malign event, such as a bomb or something like happened to Nord Stream 2, whoever did that, or it's simply something happening in the British gas market. If, for example, the pipe from Norway into Britain went, Britain would have a huge problem with its meeting gas demand. And we would not be immune from the impacts of that. So I think, Dan, what we absolutely should have in Ireland, and government have recognised this, we should have both diversity of supply and we should have reserve storage on the island, controlled by us.
So, Eamonn, why do we not have some storage capacity? No, being aware of the impact of such an event, economically, socially, Why do we not have a plan B with storage?
It's straightforwardly down, to give you a straight answer, it's down to politics. The government have assiduously worked to prevent the development of private LNG plant in the Shannon Estuary. They've been
Well,
doing this.
hang on. We'll come to LNG for a
Sure.
second.
Okay.
That's just the storage issue.
Yeah.
Why do we not have storage? As you say, the Danes, the Dutch of 200 days. We used to have a gasometer down by the Liffey, an old-fashioned gasometer. Why don't we just put up one of those somewhere?
Well, that's town gas. That wouldn't do the job. The basic reason, Dan, is that we've completely taken our eye off the ball. We actually did have gas storage in the now defunct Kinsale gas field. Sections of that field were used to store gas and then bring it on shore when it was needed for a number of years. And nobody involved in policy saw the merit in maintaining that going on into the future. Instead, all of the assets associated with that gas field have been dismantled. The rigs have been taken down, or the platforms have been taken down. I think the pipeline going out to Kinsale is still there, but I believe it's flooded with water. It's effectively not there anymore. So the fundamental reason is we have taken our eye completely off the ball, and then we've made the situation worse.
But as you say, this is in the risk register for over 10 years. Why are we going backwards? And what do you see? Is there any sort of date by which we would have some sort of storage capacity?
Oh, yeah. If you wanted to do your root cause now, get down to the ultimate root cause. There is no one person or organization who has the ultimate responsibility, the authority and the accountability to ensure that we have secure gas supply in Ireland. It's spread over quite a range of organizations, be they government departments or state-owned energy companies. So there is nobody with that single responsibility. In the old days, for example, when the ESB was a single vertically integrated monopoly, you knew exactly who was responsible if there was something wrong in the electricity supply. We've never had that on the gas side, and we don't have it now.
Let's come to liquefied natural gas. So I'm not sure everybody's aware of this, sort of nerds like me who look at energy prices. But by the summer of 2022, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and cutting off gas supplies, piped gas supplies, energy prices in Europe were 10 times their normal. And that price signal caused American liquefied natural gas ships to flood into Europe and make all this extra money, which Europeans had to pay for. And at that time, it very much looked like the winter of 2022-23 could have energy shortages in Europe because we simply wouldn't have enough gas. But the market eventually sorted it out at great expense to Europeans, and liquefied natural gas from America saved the day. I spoke to Dieter Helm, the renowned energy economist, recently, and he said that Germany, it took them 100 days after the invasion, because they were so dependent on piped gas from Russia. It took them 100 days from scratch to get LNG capability in their ports to have ships come in and get LNG into their system. Just 100 days. But the war in Ukraine now has gone on longer than the First World War. We have no LNG capacity. What's the plan?
Well, the plan at the moment is that the state has a project to build one on the right bank, on the northern side of the Shannon Estuary, near Moneypoint Power Station, and that's a project that's been given to GNI. It's a state-led project. That will probably get emergency planning permission from government directly, but very importantly, it's still going to need environmental impact assessment and appropriate assessment, as any project would require, any big infrastructure project would require. And I'm not sure how you would go about that. You'd have to talk to a legal expert. You'd probably have to invoke wartime type legislation. But if as a country, we have this long history of ignoring this exposure, the likelihood that we're going to do something as radical as wartime legislation doesn't seem to be much chance we're going to do that. There just is, there's a lack of concern, Dan, in politics at the possible exposure that we have. To me, that's entirely unacceptable. And that's why we've been pointing this out on all of the reports we've been putting out as the Irish Academy of Engineering. And my concern is that if there is a major incident and we have a gas supply, all the heads will go down. We won't be able to say, well, who didn't do what? And we actually had a small insight into this type of scenario back in 2021. The capacity market for power generation became uh, challenged because two great big plants went down for mechanical reasons. Two other plants, which were supposed to be coming on stream, those projects were stopped for various commercial reasons. And all of a sudden, we were looking at a potential shortage of electricity and loss of supply in the winter. I think it was of 2021. That led to temporary emergency generation coming in, which we pay an awful lot of money for. So we have a small insight into that. And having seen that happen in that area, I find it unbelievable that we don't have absolute urgency on the delivery of an LNG facility. And remarkably, we do have a private sector project that's been in Planola. It's been in the courts. Lots of lawyers have made an awful lot of money out of this from all of the appeals that there's been. It looks like it's now possible for Comisiún Planola to finally give it planning permission within this year, let's say. If that happens, that private sector project could go ahead. But in the meantime, your government adamantly say, no, we're going to build a state-led project. I can't explain it in any simple terms, Dan. It's just bizarre.
So what is the earliest time frame in your view, the most optimistic time frame that we would have some diversification of our energy, be it via storage or via LNG, so that we don't have to live with the risk of having the sort of catastrophic period of energy shortages, which will close businesses, potentially have rolling blackouts. If we have this in the dark, feeding our kids at night. How soon in an optimistic scenario do you think we will have some diversity and some protection?
The earliest possible, I think, is probably by about 2029, 2030, thereabouts. So if this private sector project finally got over the line, all of the homework has been done. It would need then to get to final investment decision and all of that type of stuff. But it's at the point of being ready to push towards final investment decision. On the other hand, if it doesn't go ahead and it's the state that is doing it, you need to add a couple of years onto that. So we're sometime between 2030 and 2035. We might have some additional energy security. But a key point, though, to understand is neither the state-led project nor the private sector project at the moment have a lot of storage. They have very little storage. So what you actually have is it's a pipeline, if you like, that LNG ships will plug into a tank straight into the system. And as the tanks come down, you bring another ship in. You don't have a store like Nora have, for example. And if I go back to, and you can't talk about energy without talking about numbers. The energy store that Nora has is about 20 terawatt hours.
Just Nora. What's Nora?
Sorry, the National Oil Reserve Agency. So they have oil, 1.6 million tons of oil, with a storage capacity of about 20 terawatt hours. Moneypoint's coal yard, which was shut down last year, would store about 5 terawatt hours of energy. The two LNG projects we've just been talking about, the state one and the private one, are each at about 1.2 terawatt hours. Very, very small. So the facilities being talked about at the moment don't give you that strategic store, which is a physical stock of gas in an LNG tank or more than one LNG tank, which would meet our needs in extremis.
Okay, let's the issue you raised, the Moneypoint power plant there. Why was it shut down, and what do you think should be done with it?
It was shut down as part of the effort coming out of law, coming out of policy, coming out of carbon budgets to reduce the emissions from electricity generation. That is the reason it was shut down, and it is very successful. That decision is successful. It does reduce the emissions. When you stop burning coal, your emissions go down, just as they went down previously when we stopped burning peat. Should it have been shut down? My view is no, it shouldn't. And we made that point in a report. It's too late at this stage, I think, to envisage going back to coal. We made a recommendation it should, if it's possible. And if it's not possible, then it should continue to last longer or run longer than its intended lifetime out to 2029. We said we should keep it going for a decade running on heavy fuel oil. And there's two tanks down that they give it maybe I think about 0.6 of a terawatt hour of storage. So maybe 10 days, 12 days or something of full output of that plant. So definitely we're firm in our view that Money Point should remain as an asset, a generating asset, available in extremis as it is today. We probably should put in more oil storage. There actually is planning permission for it, and keep it there for the next decade.
Okay, so we economists like to talk about trade-offs. So clearly, as you say, shutting this plant down reduces emissions because it's using dirty fossil fuels. What's the trade-off in terms of energy security? How much does it reduce our energy security by?
So if Money Point on coal would give you about 90 days of power at about 900 megawatts. That's a reasonable amount of security for the electricity system. With Money Point stopping altogether in 2029, something else is going to have to provide that capacity. So 900 megawatts of steam power plant is going to have to be replaced by 900 megawatts of gas power plant. And go back to the earlier part of our discussion, if it's supplied on gas, you have zero energy security for that. So there is a straight trade-off there, Dan.
Okay, 90 days. If the pipeline, the gas pipeline from Scotland, the two pipelines, were to go down, how long would it take to repair them? And how much work has gone into wargaming for that, preparing for that, trying to speed that process up as much as possible? And could it be done within 90 days?
Well, sure, you would hope so, but you simply don't know. Like, you're talking about pipes on the ocean bed, but from here to Britain. If they were to be ruptured for whatever reason or broken, it is a major marine logistical repair operation to get out there and fix them. You would hope it could be done within a reasonable amount of time. But bear in mind that 90 days is for Money Point only, and Money Point on its own would not be sufficient to keep the power system going. So you simply don't know. And this is why I think we do need to have a reasonable amount of gas stored. And the figure that we've been using, just if you like to inform a conversation on this, we've been talking in terms of having about 30 days of gas stored in LNG facilities. That gives you a great big buffer. And if it is stored in an LNG facility, you have the opportunity then for more stock to come in on LNG tankers over that period to keep it going beyond just 30 days.
So I kind of think back to the crash, the financial crash in 2008. Now, we economists did not warn nearly enough about the risks to that. It seems to me that people in your industry have warned very clearly the scale of the risks to our energy supply. Now, I would have thought that politicians, who remember how the political impact of and the blame they got, particularly one political party, that they would not want to run this risk, and that they would be doing everything possible to say, we did everything we could. But instead, from this conversation simply reinforces the view that I've had, is that really this is not a priority for politicians and people in government.
Yeah, I suppose two reflections on that. Number one, there's absolutely singular focus in getting towards net zero, however realistic or unrealistic that might be. The second thing is old lessons get forgotten. Maybe I'm old enough to remember the oil shocks of the 1970s. My dad was an engineer working DSB, so lots of the conversations, we were a very boring family, were about the dilemma ESB had, and was a dilemma at that time. Nobody had heard of carbon emissions between the price of electricity and security of supply. So obviously the two great oil shocks of the 1970s, the Yom Kippur War, the Iranian Revolution. Ireland had an enormous dependence on oil. We'd kind of fallen into an easy situation where oil was unbelievably abundant, unbelievably cheap. And all of a sudden we woke up in the 1970s saying, gosh, this is a risk. And Desi O'Malley it was, and I even remember reading the paper as a young fellow in college, energy Energy Ireland. So it was a government policy paper which favoured a move into nuclear power in the 1970s. And the ESB were tasked with getting ready to deploy a nuclear power plant, and they sent people, some of whom actually sit on the committee that I chair. They would have gone to places like Sweden to learn about the nuclear industry. And ultimately, ESB made a decision, and it was the correct decision, not to go nuclear, but to go to coal. And that's why Moneypoint was built. So there was in the past this huge understanding of energy security. That has been entirely lost for whatever reason. And I can't quite fathom why this issue is not taken seriously. It's taken seriously by respected economists. You mentioned Dieter Helm. I hear Colin McCarthy talking about it a lot. And they're absolutely correct. But when it comes into government, it comes into politics, we're just ignoring it, and we shouldn't be. At its simplest, we simply should not be ignoring. This is an enormous risk to the country.
Maybe something slightly more positive. As a strong believer in technological advances, solving problems, there's been a lot of talk in recent times about advances in small modular nuclear reactors, the next generation of reactors, and what they could do in terms of the cost of building them, the size. How do you think that they could at least partially improve our energy security, and over what time frame?
They could improve our energy security enormously, but in the meantime, until they arrive, we have to keep the country powered. We simply don't know when, and indeed if, these things are going to prove to be technically they should be feasible because it's existing technology. Nuclear is the biggest provider of electricity, the biggest single source of electricity in Europe, so they should work. Whether the economic aspirations turn out as well as the promoters hope remains to be seen. But I think the earliest you could imagine those being an option for Ireland is probably the 2040s. So we were in front of a joint Oireachtas committee talking on this topic last week, and the couple of recommendations we've made is Ireland should start today based on the assumption that they're going to prove themselves and they'd be good for us. Make all of the preparations. We cite the example of Estonia, which just about a week ago, coming from a standing start 3 years ago, has now passed a piece of legislation to set up their nuclear regulatory authority. So we should be starting into all of that work now while we've time on our side. And exactly, it's what we did back in the 1970s. So if these things are proven, we shouldn't be among the early movers. Ireland is a technology taker. We'd need to see 10 or 20 of these operating in Europe. And that puts you into the 2040s decade at the earliest.
Okay.
So it's a division 2 option, I would call it. It's not, they're not ready. You couldn't do an auction tomorrow and hope that somebody's going to come in and say, look, we put one up and we want a CFD of N euros, contract for difference of N euros per megawatt hour produced.
Something I meant to ask you in one of the questions that's come in, whose responsibility is it if the gas pipeline ruptures? There was a specific question that if it ruptures north of the Isle of Man, is that in British territorial waters? How does that, if it is ruptured, who's going to go out there and actually fix it?
I wouldn't attempt to answer it, but the pipelines are owned by Gas Networks Ireland. Okay, so they're owned by an Irish company. So I would take the simple view that it would be their challenge to fix those, but you really need to talk to somebody from G&I to get a definitive answer. But clearly, Ireland would need them to be fixed. They're owned by an Irish state-owned company. Therefore, that's where the responsibility lies.
Another question: green hydrogen. Is that what are your views on green hydrogen?
I think there's a number of technologies we would say we need to be building out our electricity system on for the foreseeable future, and those are onshore wind, offshore wind, fixed bottom offshore wind, and solar and storage. All of those tried, tested, and proven. Buckets of exemplars all over the world. Then you move into the second division. SMRs was the small modular reactors was the first one I mentioned. Green hydrogen I put there. That's a kind of in a division 2 technology, as is floating offshore wind. There really isn't enough of that working, proven, tried and tested. So the thing about the green hydrogen, and there was a project announced about 3 weeks ago, an ambitious project for Carlow, 2 billion project to make green hydrogen, to store it in underground caverns in granite formation, I think it was, and have a 600 megawatts of gas turbine plant powered by hydrogen. So it's an awful long way for any of those hydrogen projects or hydrogen ambitions. And ESB have done a lot of good work in this area. So you could not have a policy, I think, which is premised on definite reliance on hydrogen in the foreseeable future. You have to have a policy based on what's tried and tested, what you know you can deliver within the next 10 to 20 years. Hydrogen may never work, it may, but we don't know when. It's the date it'll be possibly working is indeterminate.
Celtic interconnector with France has been mentioned in the questions. How much does that do to improve energy security?
It depends on the view you take. If you take a view that pipelines are vulnerable, undersea cables are vulnerable. We're already importing between 15 and 20% of our electricity comes on interconnectors across the Irish Sea. As soon as the interconnector becomes energized with France, their wholesale prices are much lower than ours. I suspect that we could head to something like 25%. But we always have to have the ability to generate all of the electricity we need on the island of Ireland in extremis. And it doesn't require a great shock, such as an anchor being dragged or a thing being blown up. You could have a situation, for example, France doesn't have any surplus electricity it's willing to put out. So in the recent heat wave in France, a large number of their inland nuclear power plants had to shut down because the cooling water they depended on was too warm. They couldn't get the temperature down. I think the threshold was somewhere 25 degrees. So you can have these things happening within a given market that we're hoping to buy from, which makes it impossible for that market to sell to us. So an interconnector is they're nice things to have. Certainly we're relying on them more and more and more, the more we build. But at the final analysis, to have a reliable system, you must have the ability to meet demand at all times from generation capacity on the island. And the next step, then, you must have the fuel for the portion of that generation capacity that requires fuel, be it gas, methane, or hydrogen, or whatever else it is. And that has got to be on the island. This is basic stuff.
Okay, so the reason we're having this conversation is because of that conversation I had with Dieter Helm a few weeks ago. It's available on YouTube. I'm a macroeconomist. I'm not an energy economist. And up to that conversation, I had just assumed that we get the renewables, we get the batteries, and within a decade or so, we're in a position where we can get to net zero for electricity generation. He told me, I'm not often described as this, but he called me naive. What's your view on on how soon we could get batteries, renewables, and get fossil fuels out of electricity generation altogether?
I think he's being very polite when he said naive, Dan. Dieter has been, I've been reading his books for over a decade now, and he's been a rock of common sense. Again, I have to go into a couple of numbers. In 2024, Ireland had about 5,000 megawatts of wind turbines. We did an analysis on the output over the course of the 8,760 hours in the year, and for over 2,000 hours, the 5,000 megawatts was generating less than 500 megawatts. So intermittency is, everybody knows, the word gets used and then it gets kind of glibly ignored in policy. We're always going to need to burn something at the end of the day when the renewables just aren't going to be able to provide what we need, or we can't have enough storage to provide for a long period in the winter when solar is producing almost nothing, for example, and the winds are big anticyclone over. You need to have something to burn. That hydrogen project I mentioned earlier is an example of that. So hydrogen, as I say, it's indeterminate as to when you're going to have it's going to be available. So the only thing we can depend on is methane, natural gas stroke biomethane. That's the only fuel we can plan on today, unless you go to even greater greenhouse gas emitting fossil fuels such as oil or coal. So yeah, I think Dieter was absolutely correct on saying it's a naive idea that renewables, solar, wind, and battery storage can meet Ireland's needs. And there's another key thing, where if you look at what EirGrid have to do, EirGrid have a standard they have to meet of being able to meet all demand over the course of the year with only 3 hours loss of load expectation. That's the phrase that's used. So for all but 3 hours in the year, they have to be able to, the generation and transmission system has got to be able to meet all conceivable demand there might be on the system. That's a 99.97% service level. You cannot get that. It's just inconceivable you can get that if you're depending on batteries and renewables alone.
Okay. On that sobering and worrying note, I think we'll bring it to an end. Eamonn, thanks so much for sharing your views. I think it's very necessary that we're aware of the scale of that risk. As you say, you put our energy security at -1, which is really really worrying. But thank you for sharing your views. Thanks to our viewers who paid attention and those who sent in questions. Sorry I didn't get to quite all of them, but it's been very interesting and eye-opening. Thanks very much, Eamonn. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks for the opportunity, Dan. Bye bye.